Thank you. And I mean, the least I can do is bring you a cup of coffee, right? So you gave me a good reason to come back. It's great to be here, by the way. Thank you all so much for being here. This is my first international trip since, everything changed. So I'm so glad this could be here, because I live in Minnesota, or as I like to refer to it as Scandinavia West. All right, so I realized the first time I came over here that I now understand why so many of the folks that live where I live came from here, because if you had sort of drugged me and I didn't realize I'd traveled, I would not have realized I'd moved anywhere, because it looks about the same. So thank you so much for that. So as Matthias said, my name is Nate Schutta. The best way to describe me is architect as a service. In the old days, I used to go places. Now I get to go places again, and I talk to people about architecture and cloud and all that fun stuff. I will admit, though, the first time someone called me that, I realized it might not have been meant as a compliment. I sounded the acronym out in my head and realized they may have had ulterior motives, to say the least. So I do have a prose companion that goes with what I'm going to talk about today. So if you want to read this in another format, you can grab this from me. And if you're curious what I think about microservices, I've got thoughts on that. Imagine that. I'm an opinionated guy. Now, I've been in this architecture space for a while now, and it turns out it's a lot harder than I thought it was when I was a young, naive developer. And I thought, oh, geez, once I get to be an architect, I'll have complete autonomy and my word will be law. And then I became an architect and realized, oh no, it's much harder than that. I have all these competing agendas to deal with, and politics and people and all that stuff I used to be able to ignore. Well, I couldn't anymore. And of course, a huge part of that is the reality that technology changes. It changes all of the time. I don't think that's a particularly brilliant statement, and frankly, it's part of what I love about being in this industry. This is what keeps it fresh. I had a friend of mine, this is a few years back, and we were playing golf, actually, and we were going off, I think it was the 15th tee, and he said to me, Nate, don't you think you're getting to that point in your career where you should be getting into management? I thought, wow, John, that seems kind of insulting. Like, why would I want to do that? And he said, when I was about your age, I was getting kind of bored and I could do my job in my sleep, and then I became a manager and I was a force multiplier, and it really reinvigorated me for the second part of my career. And I said, well, that's the difference, John. I've never felt that way because my job is constantly changing. We're constantly learning new things. And that's, again, part of what I love about being in this industry. So we want to avoid legacy platforms. We don't want to be the last team on that thing that's dying. But I can't be this technology hummingbird just flitting from one technology to another every few months. Or we end up where one of my students was, she came to me and said, my app has 4 different UI frameworks baked into it now. And I totally get how this happens. Right? We picked one so many years ago, and now there's some new feature or functionality we need to add, and we can't do it with the old one, so we need to add another one. And maybe we do a bake-off, and somebody gets mad that we didn't pick theirs, and so now we've got 2, and then somebody decides to sneak in the 3rd, and then it becomes a free-for-all. We just start chasing whatever the latest new thing is. Oh, I read about this on Twitter earlier today. And so we have to be very aware of that. We have to avoid that. And I'm very much of the opinion one of the most important skills we have as developers is learning how to evaluate new technologies. I guarantee you're going to do that 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times in your career. I don't know what's coming next. I wish I did. I wish I had that crystal ball. And if you can predict the future, I definitely want to talk to you. Not about technology, though. I would like your thoughts on who's going to win, Man City versus Real tonight. I have some thoughts on that. I have some hopes on that. I'd like to know where you think the stock market's going. We can monetize your gift. No one knows what's coming next. I'm sorry. There is one thing I feel pretty confident in, though. It's going to be different than what we're doing today. And 5 years from now, most likely we're going to be using something that hasn't even been invented yet. So one of the things we have to deal with in this line of work is this pressure to always be chasing the new thing. And again, this is a norm for us. We know things are going to change. It is very tempting for us to play resume-driven design. I want to add this to the project because I want to put it on my resume so that I can use that to get the next job. And I think it's very ironic that so many in our industry want to be on the bleeding edge. I don't quite understand why. It's called the bleeding edge. It's not called the everything works well edge. At what other point in your life do you want the bleeding edge thing? A few years back, I had my hip replaced. And I assure you that when I first met my surgeon, if he had said to me, oh, Nate, I'm so glad you came in today. Listen, I was just on Twitter, and I was reading about this new experimental technique. Can I do it to you? My answer would have been to find a different surgeon. And then in our line of work, we're constantly trying to find excuses to use some new shiny thing. Now, part of that's because it's fun, right? It's enjoyable. It gives us something to play with. It's kind of like having your birthday, Christmas morning, whatever. There's always new toys for us to play with. And it is an important part of being good in this industry. This, to me, is the key to success here, right? It's this ability to learn. I get really frustrated with the way we tend to hire in this industry. We get so fixated on, this checkbox list of things, and, you need to master all these algorithms, memorize all this stuff. It's like, no, I need to know you can learn, because you will be doing something different in a few years. And it's important to understand that this never stops. It never stops. Now, it's fascinating to me that our understanding goes through this constant evolution. And, so as developers, there's things you have a strong opinion on, and there's things where you don't have an opinion, and there's things you just know other people's opinions. And, of course, the challenge for us is things are constantly moving in and out of these buckets. There's things that I used to do all the time. I did a lot of front-end development in my career. And so I had some very strong opinions on UI frameworks. I have not lived in that space in probably almost 10 years now. I'm no longer current, I guess you would say. Now, let's be very clear, though. Developers are an opinionated bunch. We often have very strong opinions. Does anyone want to debate tabs versus spaces after the keynote? And we love doing that. By the way, I don't know if you ever saw the Silicon Valley. All right, we'll do it. The Silicon Valley show on HBO, there's that one scene where the lead character breaks up with this person over tabs versus spaces. I remember watching that, and I fell off the couch laughing. And my wife, who's a business analyst, just stared at me and said, I don't get it. And so I explained it to her. It got no funnier for her. Who would have known? But this is part of it for us, right? Is so often we get caught up on the name. I've heard this a lot from developers. We need to use insert esoteric technology here on this project. And I ask a very obvious question, why? And they repeat the name to me again. And I've heard it again and again and again throughout my career. Now, I do think part of this is a fear of the old. At some point, all of us in our career, someone kind of takes us under their wing and says, hey, listen, make sure your skill set is up to date so that if you want or need to get a new job, you're good. I remember very early on in my career, I was working with this person who had the retirement countdown calculator screensaver going. And when I first started working with him, it was a 4-digit number. And I thought, I don't get that. I understand it now, right? I totally understand where he's at now. So it wasn't surprising me when that thing hit 0, the next day, he had his retirement party. But a few months later, I was walking through the building, and I ran into him, and I'm like, Dick, what are you doing here today? Did you come in to have lunch with somebody? He said, Nate, it's the darndest thing. I'm working 3 days a week, and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy. I thought, well, that's great, you jackass. How do I get that job? I want that job. But you know what? He had a legacy skill set. He knew JSON, or he knew I can't even remember some of these words anymore. He knew COBOL, IMS, DB2, all this legacy stuff. And he turned that into a really nice contract to roll out his career. Now, of course, when you've been in our industry long enough, you start to see the patterns repeat themselves. And you start to go, hey, wait a minute, I know how that movie ends. I've got the t-shirt. This doesn't end well for us. We keep reinventing things. I love this industry because we take something that we used to do and we name it something new and pretend no one's ever done anything like this ever before. Rinse, repeat. This is one of my all-time favorite Twitter threads. I love this. Developers, we're so fixated on the new because the new is always so elegant. And the old is, arcane and complex, and who wants to mess around with that? And then in the reality, it turns out actually, the old stuff is really refined and stable and tested, and well, the new stuff's buggy. So let's pick on JUnit a little bit. How old's JUnit? Anybody know off the top of their head? I think JUnit can drink legally in the US. Pretty sure. Now, if you came to me on a Java project and said, Nate, we're not using JUnit, and I said, oh, that's interesting, why not? And your answer was, because JUnit is old, we'd have a discussion about that. Now, if you said, I prefer Spock, or I prefer some other tool, that's fine. But we don't kick it to the curb just because it's old. Now, I've noticed in our industry there's a very predictable hype cycle. And luckily for me, my friend, my colleague, Cote, put out this tweet, and I immediately snagged it. By the way, Cote has the belief, and I agree with him on this, if you put enough tweets into a folder on your desktop, a keynote is spontaneously created. So year one, oh my God, this thing's amazing. Year two, hey, actually this is kind of challenging. You know, you should probably never use this for just, I don't know, putting a web front end on a relational database. Ooh, look, something shiny and new. My only complaint with Cote, and I've had this conversation with him, is his labels are wrong. It's not years, it's months or weeks. Now that does lead us to a really hard question. When should we not use a technology? We're very good at inventing reasons to use a technology. That is a core feature of being a developer. Let's be honest, we learn this through trial and error. Now, if you're like me, you probably have read some Calvin and Hobbes at some point in your life. I grew up with Calvin, and so it was really, really powerful for me when my son, about 8 years ago or so, discovered Calvin, and then I got to read him like every Calvin cartoon 30, 40, 50 times. It's fantastic. The humor is timeless. I think there's only a couple in there that reference time in any meaningful way. And there's one in particular that screams out to me that Watterson was a software engineer. He just didn't know it, and it's this one right here. How do they know the load limit on a bridge, Dad? Well, they just drive heavier and heavier trucks over the bridge till the bridge falls down, and then they weigh the last truck, rebuild the bridge. Oh, yeah, checks out. This is what we do. We do this all the time. Hey, is Mongo a good choice for this project? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Can our application support 10,000 concurrent users? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Now, I have noticed that developers tend to get bored quickly, and I don't know what's cause and effect. I don't know if we get into this industry because we have short attention spans, or being in this industry gives us short attention spans, but we are dogs chasing squirrels. You know, and it's just shiny new technology, and we run after it, and then, ooh, another shiny new technology, we run after that. And again, I understand why. Learning is what keeps us fresh. But friends, at some point, we got to get code to production. We got to deliver some business value. I can't do that if I'm constantly experimenting. Eventually, I got to commit. If I want to get good at something, I need reps. Got to develop that expertise. That doesn't happen if I only do it once or twice. I mean, think about tying your shoes. Tying your shoes is something that we all know how to do. It's trivial. If I asked you, how do you tie your shoes, you just do some hand motion. You don't even know how to describe it. Why? Because you've tied your shoes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. There was a point in your life you didn't know how to do that. If we only use this technology for a couple of weeks, how can we possibly get good at it? I got a lot of good Matt Stein tweets, but I love this one. Innovation doesn't mean using a new language, framework, or technology. Yet a lot of times we pass it off that way. Now, to be fair, tech moves really fast. There is always a new framework, a new language, a new database. We don't get a lot of time before we have to move on. Which leads to this quote, which I don't know where this came from. Insert your various internet sages here. Most of us don't have 10 years of experience. We have 1 year 10 times. You know, a lot of times people ask, like, how much experience should I have to be an architect? And of course, the answer that works for everything in software, especially architecture, is it depends. I teach a graduate class on architecture at the University of Minnesota, and I told my students in our very first session, I said, the answer to everything this semester is it depends, and boy, did they grab onto that immediately. I would just like open my mouth and someone would say, it depends. I'm like, okay, you guys are paying attention. A for you. This is the reality, though. You need to be on a project long enough to experience the consequences of your decisions, positive or negative. Too often, we do this. Well, I could refactor the code base and keep it nice and tidy, or I could just get a new job before it's my problem. I think I know which one's easier, for sure. Now, I will remind you that if you are on the bleeding edge, you will bleed. Thank you for the new version of your framework that broke all the code that used to work, said no developer ever. It's not a lot of fun, is it? And let's not forget the pioneers are the ones with the arrows in their back. Now, the challenge for us is we have to be strategic. This can't just be the technology hummingbird flitting from one new thing to another. So yeah, we do need to avoid dead platforms. We don't want to be the last people on this thing. But we can't constantly change direction just because there's something new out there. There will always be something new out there. We have to be strategic, and I want to assure you that hope is not a strategy. The best thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. May the 4th be with you. As technologists, thank you, we need to be deliberate. There are so many bits out there. There's always new languages, new techniques, new approaches. How do you keep up with all that? Now, to a certain extent, this matches your learning style. You know, I'm a visual person. I need to see it. Other people, it's reading, you know, whether that's books or blogs or Twitter. Some people like to listen. They listen to podcasts. You guys are hanging out with us this week. Thank you very much for that, by the way. Very early on in my career, I had this conversation with my then manager, and I said, hey, you know, Mary, why did you decide to get into management? Why did you decide to get out of the technology side of it? And she said, Nate, I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. I got tired of having to constantly learn new things. I didn't fully appreciate that at the time, by the way. You know, I remember early in my career missing out on some new thing. I don't even remember what it was, feeling really bad about that, like, oh no, that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor. How naive I was. You learn eventually that in this line of work, technologies are like a bus. Another one comes along every 10 or 15 minutes, so if you miss one, it's like, oh, okay, cool. I'll catch the next one. And of course, with experience, you start to go, oh, wait, no, I know where that bus is going, and I don't want anything to do with it. I'll wait for the next one. Now, the challenge for us, friends, is it's got to be a habit. This has got to be something that we do deliberately. Block out time on your calendar. I think Friday afternoon is a perfect opportunity for that. I am very much of the opinion anyone who schedules a meeting with you Friday afternoon has committed a hostile act. So hopefully, thank you. Ironically enough, we actually have a thing that kicked in during the pandemic. 2 o'clock on Friday, you're supposed to shut your laptop, whatever local time is. So I really appreciate that move. I think that's the right way to do it. Although, ironically enough, I had a team meeting at one point that was 4 o'clock on Fridays. And we gave our manager some grief about that, and his response was, well, you guys are on airplanes all the time. I figure this is the only chance I have to get you all on the ground. It's like, oh, okay, I can see that. But, you know, maybe Tuesday over lunch is what works for you, or maybe it's Wednesday morning. I don't know. You must be a guardian of your own time. You must. You have to take accountability for that. Now, I'm a big fan of what I refer to as morning coffee. I've done this throughout my career. I didn't even know it was a thing until I was talking to a buddy of mine, and he said, oh yeah, I call that morning coffee. And I said, I'm going to steal that. You take that first 15 to 30 minutes in the morning with your espresso or your latte or your tea or energy drink, whatever your drink of choice is, and you peruse the tech news, whatever that means for you. Maybe that's going through Twitter, maybe that's hanging out on InfoQ, Reddit, I don't know. You do you. But you do that before your day gets away from you. Because we all know what happens, right? You have grand plans, and then contact with the enemy happens, and then everything goes out the door, and you're exhausted at the end of the day, and you're like, what happened today? And you're like, I don't know, but I'm really tired. I don't want to do that again. I didn't get to anything on my list. Your attention is the most precious resource you have. I genuinely thank you for sharing some of it with me here today. A lot of great quotes on that. This comes from my good friend Michael. Attention is a resource. It doesn't scale. There's no way to just like, you know, here, let me get more of it. I just need more compute. Like, it doesn't work that way. We have a finite amount of it. As my friend Venkat likes to say, the greatest gift you can give someone is giving them your attention. This is something I've really learned as a parent. I mean, that's what our kids want. They want our attention. That's why when we're sitting here staring at our phones, that doesn't work so great. This is my all-time favorite quote about attention. It's a bit like real estate. They're not making any more of it. Unlike real estate, though, the value of your attention keeps going up. If you don't think your attention is valuable, ponder for a moment that there are multiple billion-dollar corporations that exist to capture and monetize your attention. Those cat videos will not watch themselves. Do not waste your attention. You cannot afford to. You need to be selective. And I know how hard this is. I really do. A lot of us have that sort of fear of missing out thing. Like, if I'm not surveying the whole field, I'll miss something. I'll let you in a little secret. If something's a big enough deal, you're going to hear about it. It will bubble into your consciousness, even if you don't want it to. It will eventually show up. I think I could make an entire deck out of nothing but Kelsey tweets. You're not going to get to surf every wave. Sorry. You're going to have to let a few go by. I'm also here to tell you, you cannot read it all. You know, in the amount of time that we've been chatting, there's a good chance that more content has been created than any of us could consume in our lifetimes. You know, when you consider how many hours of video are uploaded to YouTube and how many streaming options we have and podcasts and books and articles and tweets, I mean, it's amazing. You know, I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines. For those of you that are a little younger, a magazine's kind of like the internet, except they print it out and send it to you periodically. And so these magazines would pile up in my kitchen, and I would walk by the island and the pile would fall over, and my wife would give me a look that suggests now is an excellent time to go through the pile. And so I'd go through the pile, and most of it would get recycled because, well, it's newsy and it's not relevant anymore. I don't need to read about something from 3 months ago. And so I've let almost all of my magazine subscriptions lapse, except for the 2 or 3 that I find myself going back to. And there's one in particular that I'm pretty sure I had subscribed to for like 20 years. And so when like the 3rd renewal notice came in, my wife's like, "Are you sure?" And I said, yeah, I've got a year's worth right here. So if I haven't read it in a year, probably not going to. Now, of course, today I think it's even worse because you have so many things that you can possibly consume your time with. I mean, how many different streaming options do we have? Every time I turn around, there's a new streaming service that has something that you really want to watch on it. And we could have a fascinating conversation about that. This is where I should give a plug for Ted Lasso. I try to almost answer every tweet these days with a Ted Lasso gif because that's the answer. The reality, friends, is heat death of the universe is going to happen before you read everything that's out there. You're going to have to let some stuff go. And again, if it's a big deal, you're going to hear about it. It will bubble into your consciousness. You're going to miss almost everything that gets produced. That's okay. The other thing I want to tell you is it's okay for us to say, "I don't know, but let me find out." You can't be an expert on all things at all times. That way lies madness. This is a really good thing for us to do as senior engineers to junior engineers. Make sure they know, yeah, I got you. I don't understand why that works either. I was helping somebody with something and like rebooting fixed it, and I was really dissatisfied with that. And I said, "I'd really like to tell you or explain why, but I can't. I don't know why that worked. It shouldn't have, but such is the universe that we live in." I mean, this is the reality. Actually, hey, how about that? I'm using a Schutta quote. Imagine that. You know, this is the reality of the world we live in, friends. This is the reality of the world we live in. Don't shame someone because they don't know something. We can't know everything. I suspect that this was actually what's the word, that this was photoshopped, but you know what? I'm going with it. Because there's a lot of this in our space, isn't there? It's like, let's see, I put a semicolon here and somehow that made it work. I don't know why. Probably fine. This is the reality, right? Is the best engineers are willing to admit when they don't know something. They don't fake it until they figure it out. They're willing to say, yeah, I'm not really sure. Let's have a conversation about that. Now that's hard because you have to be humble and you have to have some confidence. But here's the reality. You can't know all of it. There's just impossible. And there's nothing wrong with specializing. You know, think about doctors. For a long time, doctor was a pretty broad term. You went to the same person to have your leg amputated, a tooth pulled, a shave, you know, it was all the same person. And now you have doctors that specialize in being general practitioners. You have orthopedic surgeons that only do hips or knees or elbows or shoulders. It's a level of specificity that's pretty amazing. So what do we mean when we say, oh, I want a full stack developer, or I'm a full stack developer? What does that mean? If we're trying to do letter of the law here, it doesn't exist because you'd have to know, I don't know, 3, 4 different JavaScript frameworks. You'd have to know a bunch of different databases. You'd need to be very fluent in different languages, different cloud providers. And you know about CI/CD and DevOps and SRE and all that stuff. And probably some security and how to test your code and a little bit of project management. And, you know, I mean, that's just scratching the surface. Where's that unicorn? It doesn't exist. Now, I think what we really mean by this is much, much simpler. Someone who is willing to work on whatever part of the code base needs some tender loving care today. Or another way of thinking about it, these specialized generalists. Now, some people would call this T-shaped. I hear that. I also hear like H-shaped. There's a bunch of different ways of thinking about this. But the idea is that you have a breadth of knowledge, you know a little bit about a lot of things. You've gone deep in a couple of different areas. So maybe you know a couple of frameworks, or you know a couple databases, a couple providers. But the reality here is that you've gone deep on part of it, one or two of those. And that's hard for us to do, for sure. There's no getting around it. And I think it's hard for us to be willing sometimes to learn the new thing. Sometimes it's hard for us to realize, okay, I can't know every possible thing that's out there. There are these things that we know we don't know, and of course there's this giant ocean of things that we don't know, and that's okay. The challenge for us as technologists is I can't adopt every new thing that comes out. I just can't. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, where should I be investing my time? What makes sense for me? Now, some people would say, oh, you know what, it's all instinct. I have a radar that tells me what's going to work or not. So Paul Graham wrote this piece a number of years ago, and for those of you who know Paul Graham, he's a very influential thought leader type person. Started a company, sold it for a bunch of money, and so he wrote this piece, and he was talking about Java, and he actually had some really interesting points for things he evaluates. But he sums up his article by saying, I have a hunch that Java won't be a very successful language. Now, we obviously sit here with perfect hindsight and we go, oh my God, that's so silly. How can you say that? Java is in the top 3, top 5 most successful languages of all time. We can have a fascinating debate about where it is in that list, but it is undoubtedly a very successful language. Now, he admitted, hey, I've never written a line of Java, but I looked at some books that told me everything I needed to know. So maybe our instincts aren't quite enough. Although I will say judging covers can be useful. Years ago, I was at this company and we adopted some visual drag and drop thing, and I was very skeptical of it, especially when our very first training class, the person gets up in front of a room full of developers and says, the best thing about our product is you don't need any developers. He said to a room full of developers. Needless to say, that didn't get me started off on the right foot, but one of my colleagues thought this was amazing. He thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. And so I was talking to him one day and I said, all right, hang on a sec here. How do you do a diff? This is all visual. This is all drag and drop. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, how do you tell what I changed? Or how can you tell what someone else changed? And he said, oh, that's a good question. Well, you know what I could do? I could do a screen capture, and then I could visually compare. I'm like, well, that's not great. And they said, all right, well, riddle me this. How do you write an automated test for this? And he said, well, Nate, that's the best part. Because of the guardrails, you can't make any mistakes. You don't need any tests. And that's what I'm like, I'm out. This isn't going to work for me. Now, in the same breath, we do have to be aware of our own bias. This happens. We've all had a bad experience with JavaScript at some point. I like to pick on JavaScript. I've written a lot of JavaScript. I've written a lot of bad JavaScript. But you know what? JavaScript's improved. It really has. It really has. We need to think about where the community is at. That's certainly part of this, although we have to make sure we're not lemmings just jumping off the cliff because everybody else is. Are we skating to where the puck was? We see that a lot. Now, I'm a huge fan of the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks on a regular basis. It basically takes their experience across lots and lots of projects with lots and lots of smart people, filters it through another group of very smart people that we all know and admire in many cases, and then they put out this artifact that every time one comes out, I'm like, oh, that's cool. I hadn't thought of that. Oh, that's interesting. Always something new and interesting in this, in my opinion. I wish the 20% time thing had taken off in a bigger way. This was a part of being at Google. You got a day a week to scratch your own itch, play with your own toys. This is such an amazing relief valve because developers want to play with new things, and when they don't have an opportunity, they sneak it in. So give them a chance to do that in a safe environment. Now, unfortunately, that has kind of fallen out of favor, but maybe we could practice Innovation Friday. It doesn't have to be every Friday. It could be once a month. Could be once a quarter if you had to. Maybe it's just Friday afternoon. Maybe we need to have a regular Tuesday Tech Talk series. I had someone say to me, oh yeah, we do that. We call them chew and spews. I went, no, that's a bad language. Lunch and learn, yes. Chew and spew, no. That has bad connotation to it. I'm a huge fan of these architectural briefing concepts. This is actually something a friend of mine came up with. It's a little more formalized way of doing this. He has like a set of questions that you're trying to get through as you play with these new things. So essentially what it boils down to is one person goes and does some research and then brings it back to the team. And no, you don't have to be an architect. That's just what he calls it. But it's basically, why should we use this thing? What do we need to know in order to understand that? What do we need to know in order to use it? Now, this does not need to be a 4-hour workshop kind of thing. This should be a short half hour, 45 minutes, an hour. This is not the deep dive how-to. But we do want to get past hello world, to-do list level stuff. And this should be two-way traffic. We should be going back and forth. Attendees should be taking good notes. They should be asking good questions. They should be bringing their own experience to bear, saying, hey, you know, I used something like this in the past. It suffered from this. Is that a problem here? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why not? And by the way, you're doing one of these in the future. Now, if we're lucky enough to get past that briefing filter, it's time to roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty. It's time to do a workshop. Now, here's the challenge. You are never going to get enough time to do everything that you want or need to do. You have to be very particular. You're going to have to think about what are the key things I need to prove or disprove and make sure I have time to do that. Someone asked me a few years ago, should I use Angular or should I use React? I said, well, the best way to figure that out is write the program in Angular, then rewrite it in React and throw away the one you don't like. Now, unfortunately, no one's going to give us the resources to do that. So you have to take some shortcuts. So you have to figure out, all right, well, what are the things we care most about that we need to prove out? And so give yourself a couple hours, as much time as you can, a few exercises, see what you can do. Now, I want to also stress, this should be done within the constraints of your own universe, whatever that happens to be. I was talking to someone a few years back, and they had done the UI change, and they'd realized they needed something new, and they did their survey of the field, and they kind of did their proof of concept on 2 or 3 of them. And he said, we kind of got caught up in the hype around this one, and so we fell in love with it, and we thought, oh, this will be so easy. We'll just sprinkle it in to our existing legacy code base. It won't be a problem. Well, I met him about 6 months into that process, and he said, yeah, it's a problem. We're going to have to rewrite our application to use this framework. Now, I'm convinced if they would have done their proof of concept work inside the confines of their environment, basically fork their repo and try it there, they would have seen those problems. Now, they may have still made the same choice, but they would have known, oh, yeah, we're going to have to do more work than we thought. We can all get this stuff to work greenfield. It's what happens when that makes contact with your world and your constraints. So give yourself some time. Focus on the just getting people in there to play around with it. Don't be afraid to go off script. Try some other stuff out. Hey, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? If we pass the hands-on filter, now it's time to trial it somewhere in our organization. So now we want to put the rubber to the proverbial road. Let's find a real project where it's a good fit, I might add, and see what happens. Now, this is rarely going to be a bet the company project because it might fail. In fact, it probably will fail. That's sort of the goal here. Now, I will admit, sometimes we have to do the opposite. Sometimes we have to do one of these to prove it is a bad idea. We actually burned a couple iterations once, proving that this new frameworky thing they wanted us to use was not actually the best thing to do for create, read, update type applications. It was good for the space that it was purchased for, but not for everything. And of course, the person who brought it in wanted to justify its existence, and so they wanted us to use it on literally every project we had. So we had to prove that that was a bad idea. Now, it is important for us to keep up with what's happening in our industry. But I will admit this can be very overwhelming. I think one of the things the last 2 years has taught us is that self-care is kind of an important thing. We need to be kind to ourselves. And as I've gotten deeper into my career, I realized that learning should not be a point of stress for you. And for a lot of us it is. It's just like, oh my God, I need to know this thing. I need to play with this thing. It's okay to wait until you need it. There's no value that comes from burning yourself out, at the expense of your family, at your health, of your loved ones, your hobbies. We need to have more than just staring at screens and playing around with these things. That's part of the challenge for us, I think. Now, I will be the first to admit that the new hotness is not our only concern. We need to make sure we're staying current. If you think about the bugs that we've seen over the last several years, they're getting bigger and bigger. They're affecting tens of thousands, millions of people. At this point, all of our data has probably been exposed to some dark web thing. I have a friend that's in the security space, and I made that comment to him one day. I said, is there any chance my data's not in the dark web somewhere? And he said, no. Do you want to go find it? I said, no. I do not want to know about the parts of the internet you have to mess around with. We're all targets, by the way. Now, I think, unfortunately, this map was taken down. But this was a great way of keeping awake if you didn't have access to espresso. And you just see how many live attacks were happening at any given moment. It's pretty stunning. The people who are trying to get into our systems, they're like velociraptors. They're just looking for an unlocked door. Actually, I think they're kind of like my cats. I have 2 cats, Han and Chewy. Yeah, I didn't name them that just because today is May the 4th. They can get into cupboards and drawers in our lower levels. We actually had to re-baby-proof our lower level because they kept opening things. And there's a couple they can still get into despite the baby-proofing, and we haven't quite figured out how. One of them figured out how to open the drawer even though there's no pulls. That's wonderful. I think they're looking for treats. I'm not really sure. They can even, at one time, one of them actually opened the door to our bedroom, which we have to keep locked, or shut, I should say, because, well, they're little devils, and they mess with things. I came home one day to discover that my shave brush was in the litter box and needed a new shave brush after that. That was fun. So a former colleague of mine wrote this piece on the 3 R's of security, this rotate, repair, repave concept. And it's one of the sort of interesting shifts that we've seen in our industry. It used to be pour concrete on it, nobody touch it, we don't want to upgrade, that's too expensive, it takes too long. And now you realize, actually, if you rotate, repair, repave on a regular basis, that's what keeps you safe. Because you're blowing away the opportunity for them to sit there and grow and have these things turn into really nasty attacks. If you're constantly repaving your data center, they can't get that toehold, which they can then do really destructive things with. So do you have a patching strategy? Do you know what that looks like in your organization? When the Log4j CVE came out, was that like whatever, or did everybody get real panicked and flop sweat happened and oh my God, what are we going to do about this? Now, to be fair, we've seen some huge shifts in our engineering discipline, haven't we? I remember when there was a collections issue, I don't even want to admit how many years ago, same kind of thing, like, oh God, we need to fix this right away. What do we do about it? And for the architecture team, we knew where it was in our organization. That wasn't the hard part. It was getting all the teams to upgrade. That was a hard part. It was getting all of the things that also used that upgraded. That was the hard part. Things have gotten better. What version of a thing are you on? Do you know? A lot of organizations have a policy. You must be on current major version -1. It is easy to have a policy. Policies are trivial. It's measuring it or enforcing it that's hard. Years ago, I was doing an architecture review, and I asked the presenting architect, hey, what version of that library are you on? He said, oh, I'm on 4.3. I said, congratulations, I have to mark you yellow. He said, what? Why? I said, because you are N-3. When did that happen? I said, well, about 6 months ago. I sent out a bunch of emails on it. Was I supposed to come to your project room and tell you to your face? Apparently the answer to that was yes. No, all I could do as a reviewing architect was mark it yellow. I couldn't stop them from going to production. For all I know, it's still running in production today with N-12 or some crazy thing. Now that, friends, is more of a cultural change. And let me not lie, changing culture is really, really hard. What would you rather do? Change your patching strategy, changing your culture, or be on the next largest hack ever? A huge part of this, friend, is understanding pros and cons. You know, one of the things that I've had to explain to a lot of developers is there is no best. There's least worst. And that's frustrating because we want something to be objectively good. That's not how it works in our industry. Every single choice we make is a trade-off. So anytime someone says to you, this is the most amazing technology ever, you should immediately ask, what are the trade-offs? Because there are always trade-offs. This is design. This is the essence of what we're trying to do, friends. That's the art of architecture. Or to paraphrase former US president, please someone give me a one-handed technologist. Because what do? Well, should we use React? Should we use Angular? Should we use Vue? Should we refactor the monolith to microservices? Should we be on-prem? Should we be in the public cloud? Turns out there are 3 answers to every question you've ever been asked in computer science. There's 42. That's to see who's well-read. My favorite pattern as an architect is another layer of indirection. But I think you know what I'm going to say next. It depends. It depends. I wish there was a recipe. I wish there was a formula. If you've ever seen Dead Poet Society, there's that scene where they go through the beginning of that poetry book, and it's like, you can measure the value of the poem, but it's like, no, you can't. Rip that out. That's not how it works. The interesting thing for us is in a lot of cases, the answer is actually and, not or. This is hard, because then we have to give people guidance on when should I use this or that. So I brought React into an organization where we already were using Angular, and my director was fine with that, but he said, Nate, you've got to give teams advice on when they should use one or the other. You can't just make it a free-for-all. That's what we're trying to do here, is balance those forces. That's the art of architecture. There is no such thing as a perfect technology. Don't ever pretend that. They all have drawbacks. So acknowledge the negatives. If you bring a new technology to me, there's a couple questions I'm going to ask you. The first one is, what do you like about it? I'm going to let you know a secret. I don't really care. Well, I mean, I do because I'm interested, but this isn't the important question. The important one's my follow-up. What don't you like about it? You better have an answer to this. If you don't have an answer to this, that tells me you haven't worked with it long enough. Right? Pick something that you love, that if I tried to take it away from you, we would have a passionate conversation. There's something about it you don't like, and you can express that. That tells me you've worked with it long enough to know where the dragons are. You know where the edge of the map is. There's a great way, by the way, to pull this out of somebody in an interview. If someone comes to you and they're an expert on Java, say, that's great, you've been in Java a long time. I'm going to put you in charge of Java. Your word is law. Brian has to listen to you. He can't ignore you. What would you add? Now, before you get to add that shiny new feature, what would you remove? This will tell you how critically someone has thought about that technology they're an expert on, without a doubt. A lot of us are very good at the first one. Well, I'd add this feature that's been missing forever, but it's a lot harder. Okay, what would you pull out? I will tell you, every time I've used this, I rarely get a good answer, honestly. And when you do get a good answer, it's the kind of candidate that you don't want to let leave until you've given them a job offer. And then you get the people who stammer, I would get rid of that thing that was deprecated 15 years ago, and I would add something that's already been added. It's a great way of pulling that out, friends. I'll leave you with this. Kelsey's tweet. As always, there's a Kelsey tweet. You haven't mastered a tool until you understand where it should not be used. This is so important for us. Again, very easy for us to justify, I want to use this. Why? Because I want to put it on my resume. Yeah, but where should we not use it? Where's the edge of the map? Where is a better tool, the right tool to use? Friends, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. This has been great. It's so good to be back in person. Thank you so much. Cheers.